fusion philosophy นี้แล้วแน่นอนนะครับแล้วก็สำหรับข้อสรุปของการการพยายามพิจารณาปัญหาเรื่องเซลฟ์สำหรับวันนี้นะฮะก็คืออาจารย์ไดฟัสเนี่ยคือตัดความเป็นไปได้ที่จะมีเซลฟ์เรื่อง core self กับ extended self นะครับโดยมองไปที่การแยกระหว่างตัว subjectivity กับตัว self ว่ามันไม่เหมือนกันนะ subjectivity นี่ก็คือที่เราพูดเรื่อง I นะครับการมีประสบการณ์ณจุดนั้นคือเราไม่ได้เป็นเจ้าของประสบการณ์นะครับซึ่งอันนี้มันคือทัศนะแบบการที่เรามี self เพราะฉะนั้นการพูดถึงในตัว pre-effective self awareness ตัวนี้เนี่ยที่เรามี subjectivity ได้แต่เราไม่จำเป็นต้องมี self นะครับมันเป็นข้อเสนอที่ค่อนข้างจะใหม่สำหรับการศึกษาเรื่อง self ในทางปรัชญาร่วมสมัยนะครับซึ่งอาจารย์ไดฟัสก็สำทับว่าด้วย approach แบบนี้แบบ fusion philosophy เนี่ยเราอาจจะมีที่มีทางให้สำหรับพุทธศาสนาได้ในโลกยุคปัจจุบันนะครับ
So the question is, what is the task of Buddhist philosophy? And one answer, which is perfectly valid, is to say the goal of Buddhist philosophy is just to support Buddhist practice. And I have no problem with this answer. I have a different view, which is Buddhist philosophy should not just remain parochial discipline, but should be part of the global context, the global discourse, philosophical discourse, and should engage other philosophical tradition. And my example is what happened in Indian Buddhist philosophy from about the 2nd century AD, when Buddhists engaged other schools. Prior to that period, the time is actually hard to determine, but if you look at the Buddhist texts in India, in ancient India, you see there is first a time when there is a discussion about what is canonical and what is not canonical. Then at the latest, another stage, there is a discussion among Buddhists, what is the meaning of different terms like Chetana, Karma, and so on. And then later on, maybe by 1st, 2nd century, you see Buddhists engaging non-Buddhists. And that's my example. That's what I think Buddhist philosophy should try to do. Like ancient Indian Buddhist thinkers, they should not limit themselves to talking with other Buddhists in a kind of Buddhist language, but they should try to use the language that other people speak in the same way that Indian Buddhists use the language that other schools was using to make their point across through arguments in a sustained debate. And this is with other schools, and this is, I think, a good model for modern Buddhist philosophy.
ครับผมก็คืออาจารย์ไดฟัสก็เป็นข้อเสนอนะครับว่าพุทธถ้าจะอยู่ในโลกปัจจุบันคุณจะทำยังไงนะโดยแกยกตัวอย่างไปที่อดีตนะครับที่พุทธในสมัยเริ่มต้นมีพุทธศาสนาในช่วงต้นศตวรรษนะครับมันก็มีสำนักต่างๆมากมายดาชานเนี่ยนะครับสำนักต่างๆมากมายที่มีข้อพิพาทกับกลุ่มอื่นซึ่งมันไม่ใช่พุทธนะครับก็คือเขามีการถกเถียงข้ามนิกายข้ามศาสนาข้ามอะไรอย่างนี้ได้ซึ่งไอตัวอย่างซึ่งมันเคยเกิดขึ้นแล้วในประวัติศาสตร์เนี่ยอาจารย์ไดฟัสเห็นว่ามันควรจะเป็นสิ่งที่ชาวพุทธในปัจจุบันเนี่ยควรจะทำตามนะครับก็คือต้องออกไปหาโลกบ้างนะครับไปพูดภาษาอื่นที่มันนอกไปจากภาษาทางพุทธศาสนาในกรณีนี้ก็คือภาษาทางปรัชญานะครับก็คือเอาประเด็นปัญหาทางปรัชญาโดยไปพูดไปมีไดอะล็อกกับเขาบ้างนะครับ
So I think there are clear advantages of doing that. There are also disadvantages, meaning engaging a terrain and a language that are alien. So this is obviously a choice. And this is, in a way, the predicament of Buddhists in the modern age. They are part of a global culture that originated for the most, not only, but from the most part in the West. And so what do you do when you engage it? or do you don't engage it? Obviously, you know what my choice is, and that's what me and some of my friends call fusion philosophy, because I think that the example of the great thinkers of Buddhist India is the best example to follow. Engage our tradition by using a common discourse and putting across the Buddhist view, which I think is an invaluable resource for humanity.
ครับก็คือเป็นข้อสรุปสัมภาษณ์อีกทีนะครับคือแน่นอนพูดไม่ใช่กระแสหลักอยู่แล้วเพราะฉะนั้นสิ่งที่เราจะทำได้แล้วก็ทางเดียวที่ตามที่อาจารย์ไดฟัสพอจะคิดออกนะครับก็คือเราต้องไปพูดภาษาของเขาก็คือภาษาของเวสต์หรือว่าตะวันตกซึ่งมันมีอำนาจใหญ่กว่านะครับซึ่งอันนี้มันก็เป็น approach แบบ post colonial นะครับดังนั้นข้อเสนอก็คือทางอื่นที่เราจะทำได้ที่เราควรทำและทางเดียวที่เราทำได้ก็คือก็คือ embrace ไอตัว fusion philosophy นี้ขึ้นมาแล้วก็ทำให้พูดมันไปอยู่ในโลกให้ได้นะครับครับผม
โอเค That's it
ครับผมจบแล้วครับถ้าใครมีคำถามก็if you have a question yes this is the time
You need to, if you have a question, you need probably to come here, right? Okay.
Just going to talk about something about in the context of animal awareness. As I see in some experiments in the octopi,
Yes. Yes.
also seems to have a certain awareness.
Yes.
And another point is, can there be a self without an awareness? And there are levels of awareness, of course,
Yes.
like the waking, dreaming,
Yes.
hypnagogia, and then hypnagogia, various stages of it is one to see.
ครับคำถามก็คือในกรณีของปลาหมึกนะครับคือเราอาจจะเคยอ่านว่าปลาหมึกนี่ฉลาดมากใช่ไหมครับคือถ้าสมมติว่าเราจะเคลมว่าตัวปลาหมึกที่มันมีเซลล์หรือว่ามีเซลล์ของแพลเนสเนี่ยเงื่อนไขเนี่ยมันคืออะไรบ้างนะครับจะมีได้ไหม
แต่ว่ามันจะเป็นมีขึ้นแทรกนะ
Sorry just translate answer question sorry
Okay. Yeah, no, I think you're right. And when I teach my class on consciousness, I have a colleague who does animal cognition, and so we teach together. I think animal cognition is a very interesting topic to try to understand, because in Western philosophy there is a tendency to privilege thinking over experiencing. And I think that's a really big problem in understanding consciousness, but there is a tendency to think that consciousness is thinking, or thinking is consciousness, and I think that's a really problematic way of looking at consciousness, because consciousness is not just a top-down phenomenon, it's also a bottom-up phenomenon. And so a lot of way in which consciousness is conceptualized in the West really ignore this bottom-up dimension, which I think is most important, most useful, and is better seen in animal cognition, and is also very important in Indian and Buddhist thinking.
Is this on? Thank you. I just want to thank you for coming to Chiang Mai and sharing your wisdom with us. It's whatever little wisdom you have. It's something that's been missing here, and I hope that this is something that can continue. To have someone of your stature and experience to come and talk with us and share was great. Quick question: when you say the core sense of self and the extended sense of self are mistaken. I just want you to explain a little bit about what is mistaken. Are we talking about delusion here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So delusion and mistaken can be used synonymously?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
That's what I mean.
Thank you.
Illusion is a good word because it has the word illusion, right? And the core sense of self is an illusion, right? From an evolutionary perspective, it might have been useful because it helps us to mobilize emotional resources for the sake of self-preservation, right? But it is a cause of suffering as well. So yeah, that's exactly what I mean.
I don't really know much about Buddhism, but so this is probably a very classical question then. So if it is the delusion, if the core sense of self and the extended sense of self are delusions, why do we plan for the future? Why do I plan what I'm going to do after this lecture?
Yeah, it is a classical question. It's actually an important one. The reason I care about is that what I care about is suffering and happiness from a Buddhist perspective, and I care about avoiding suffering. And so, in order to avoid suffering, I want to plan for the future, right? And that's what I think, that's maybe one reason, evolutionarily speaking, to think about why we have a self. So my view is actually strange because I think the self is really important, but it's also the cause of suffering. And so as Buddhists, we are not trying to reverse evolution, but we are trying not to be prisoner of evolution and not suffer uselessly, right? Right?
I don't really get it. Surely I will suffer if I don't think about what I'm going to eat to live tomorrow.
Well, you will
suffer.
Okay, here's the distinction. You have the distinction between person and self. Today I talked about self, which is how I understand myself from the first person perspective. The idea of person is from a third person perspective, right? And so from a third person perspective, I will continue to exist tomorrow as a person, not as a self. What I've talked today is just the idea of self subjectively from a subjective perspective. And so you have to differentiate the idea of person from the idea of self. Today is just about self, but it's the first person perspective. How do I experience myself?
Sorry, I came quite late this evening because I got lost and that's my sense of self and direction on the way here. So hopefully you can hear me. My question is, going back to someone like Lacan and Lacan's idea of the reflective self, the mirror self, and I think what makes us different from animals, using the Lacanian argument, is the sense that we look in a mirror and we have this sense of a big other in the mirror, something outside of us. Which is another signifier. So the Lacanian argument about self seems centered on the idea of language, based on structural linguistics.
Yeah.
So we have our sense of self comes from linguistics, comes from structural linguistics, which is something that certainly contestably animals do not share. And my second point would be looking at German idealism, looking at someone like Hölderlin in Being Good Judgment. Hölderlin's point that we have a consciousness, we're part of being, and then when we start to judge, we develop a sense of self because we become somehow divided. So maybe the sense of self is also deeply connected with division. So it's an ontological division which gives us a sense of self. And finally, Heidegger's sense of Dasein and thrownness, which I think also gives us a sense of self. So a sense of self is a sense of division, either ontologically through Heidegger's argument or linguistically through Lacan. I think these are interesting ideas to consider what we think of the self.
I would actually disagree with your interpretation of Heidegger, but anyway, we're not in a Heideggerian seminar, so I will. I think I would just make a remark, which is that the sense of self we are talking about are already fairly high in the scale of development, and I think there are more primitive sense of self which are at work. And I think Buddhist practice, actually, Buddhist deconstruction of the self concerns very importantly with more basic levels of selfhood, like the core self. And I think the core self is present not just in human beings, but in many animals. It's hard to imagine for me an animal who is functioning in complex way and doesn't have that kind of core sense of self. And so now, what Lacan, I'm not a Lacanian specialist either, but I think the mirror, the idea of the mirror